Alright, hi everyone. Hi everyone. Welcome to this week's Taxi. Today we welcome Felix Verheyden. He graduated here 2 years ago at our university and then went to the Berlage in the Netherlands, where he graduated this February. And he's presenting rooms and corridors. So
thank you.
Give the word to you.
Thanks. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks, Abel and the Taxi team, for this talk. And in this lecture, I would like to talk about the spaces that we came to define as rooms and corridors. And I will first do that through a little bit of theory, a text called Figures, Doors and Passages, and then I will go through a little bit of projects that I've been part of at the Berlage. And well, it's already been said about myself, so I can just continue. So, we have to start. Ordinary things contain the deepest mysteries. It is with this bravado of an opening sentence that Robin Evans, the English architect historian, starts his article that goes by the name Figures, Doors and Passages. Evans comes to the conclusion that in the 80s there is actually very little known about the history of the corridor. Of course, this is written in the 80s, and since then there has been some new publications, like a book called Corridors, and was published in 2019, which gives a complete overview, but at the time there was still little known. And what is also important to note is that Robin Evans in this text, he does not intend to give a super complete or a super accurate overview of the whole history of the corridor in the world, but rather he's trying to make a case for what the underlying cultural shifts are in Europe, which incentivized the invention of the corridor. You can see here the transition from an enfilade plan to the corridor plan. Before 1650, people lived in houses which were just a series of rooms, and then after 1650, suddenly there is this corridor. And in order to understand these cultural shifts, Evans does something very interesting. He takes 3 paintings to clarify the shift in how people treat each other, how they see each other, and how they see themselves. And so he argues that between the early Renaissance and the High Renaissance, you can see that the humanism, which is at the base of the Renaissance thinking, that it amplified, that it intensified, and that it triggered an extra emphasis given on the human aspect or the human experience. And so you can see that, for example, in the removal of the hierarchy between the biblical figures and the saints. They touch each other. They look each other in the eyes. But also the child, which you can see in the lower right corner, which is Saint John, he looks at the spectator right in the eyes, so you become involved into the scene. And so the hierarchy is completely gone. You can also see that the architecture goes more to the background, where in the early Renaissance, knowledge and know-how were the dominant topic to paint about. In the late Renaissance, knowledge and know-how became rather a supporting tool to bring emotions across. And so, very simply put, where the early Renaissance painting was about displaying knowledge, the late Renaissance painting was about displaying people. Don't shoot me for this generalization, but we need to make it to get the point across. And then between the 16th century and the 19th century, something else happened. Western painting made like a 180-degree turn again. And so, just like in the early Renaissance, the woman in the painting has an inward-looking gaze. She looks a bit dreamy, and she seems caught in her thoughts. And what is more, instead of being surrounded by people, she's surrounded by embellished objects that are painted in order to represent her personality. And so this shift from an outward expression in the late Renaissance to an inward expression in the Art Nouveau or considerably romantic painting seems to mark a big cultural shift from collectivism to individualism. And it is this change from collectivism to individualism that Evans points out as the starting point for the invention of the corridor. And again, the choice of painting is certainly not random because these authors of the paintings, Raphael and William Morris, are also architects. And so their ideals of people living together and their ideological preferences are very much embedded in their architecture and in the way they design rooms and use or not use corridors. Now, to that end, the following slides are a series of plans that were decisive in the transition from an enfilade plan to the corridor plan. What I want you to specifically look at are those plans in between, because I personally believe that they contain the best of both worlds. So to start with the Villa Madama in Rome, a house commissioned by Giuliano de' Medici, later known as Pope Clement. It was built in the 16th century and was designed by Raphael. Now, Percier and Fontaine, a French neoclassical duo of architects in the 19th century, loved it very much. And they made a reconstruction of the plan. And what turns out, the reconstruction is completely false, because there is no such symmetry in the plan that they imagined there to be. If you look at the earliest surviving plan, you can see that every room in the plan is actually conceived to be completely different. And we can attribute this strange sequence of ever-changing rooms to that same late Renaissance thinking, which is humanism, where the human experience prevailed. That is to say that the symmetry of the rooms that you would never see together because they're somewhere else in the plan, it doesn't make any sense to have symmetry between them, because if you walk through the building, you would never know that the rooms far away from each other were symmetrically designed in plan. Instead, only what in the eyes of the beholder is visible is planned out symmetrical. And that is to say that the outside facade and outside form, or for example also the courtyard and the vistas, are planned out symmetrically. Now, Evans writes the following about it. There was a door wherever there was a room, making the house a matrix of interconnected chambers. And he also writes, in a Villa Madama, as in virtually all domestic architecture prior to 1650, there's no qualitative distinction between the way through the house and the inhabited spaces within it. Hence, the fact that people allowed each other to enter their rooms, to be part of it, in order to go from one side of the building to the other, is in accordance with that same pleasure of proximity of others that we saw in the Madonna dell'Impanata by Raphael. Something as well very clearly visible is another painting by Raphael, the School of Athens, where you can also see this joy of having company around. But as we already have discussed with the paintings, the joy of collectivism decreased. And one of the first records of an explicit presence of a corridor can be found in 1597. And this is the Beaufort House in England. It's designed by John Thorpe, and you can see that there's this linear space. And it is not yet named the corridor. You can see on the plan that it has scribbled down a long entry hall. Now, the first confidence appearance of the corridor as an integral part of the conception of a building can be found 50 years later in a house called Coleshill by Roger Pratt. Pratt argued that the reason for such a linear space was to get rid of the inconvenience of intruding servants. In that way, the corridor was used as a segregating tool to separate the servants from the served. Yet the rooms still stayed very much connected, and rooms still had multiple doors, so the joy of company and presence of others did not necessarily completely vanish. So what you see here is some kind of a mixed form of the corridor plan and the enfilade plan. A more, let's say, elegant application of this mixed form of enfilades and corridors can be found in the Amesbury House, again in England, this time by the hand of John Webb. What can be said about this plan is that in the 17th century, there was no real systematization of the use of the corridor, no methodological use. And hence you can find all of these exploring, experimental mixed types that both contain the enfilade as well as the corridor. But however, something that becomes clear is that the openings in between the rooms start to serve merely as aesthetical vistas, dus doorzichten, rather than to serve their initial practicality. You can observe that through the linear position of the openings that correspond as well with the positioning of the window. So you have a long way you can look through. Evans says that he had a very hard time understanding what spurred exactly this transition from an interconnected room to the private room, where there's only a door to the corridor. Why did we suddenly need all this privacy? Maybe, he thinks, at least for the English, one of the causes can be assigned to the emergence of the Puritans, an English Protestant movement in England and the United States between the 7th and the 18th century. The Puritans believed that one must armor from the outside world because it's very naughty and bad. Maybe the sensitivity of protecting yourself from that bad outside blended with architectural thinking. For instance, there's the story of Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather is an American important Puritan who was known to put hints and notes on doors to keep them out, that they would only get in for important reasons. For example, he wrote, "Be short," on the door of his study room. Anyway, Evans argues that both the soul and the room came to be thought of as something private. This very clear distinction between the private room and the shared corridor evolved in the 19th century in something more systematic. Here, for example, we see a diagram by Robert Kerr in which a clear distinction is made between the trajectory through the house and the positions of the rooms. And it is maybe at this point of culmination in the 19th century where the presence of the corridors is thought to be so evident when it comes to providing privacy that we may forget that privacy was also an issue before 1650, thus also in Renaissance thinking. Alberti, for example, also acknowledged the need for privacy, but he believed that this could be done through a system of filtration. The act of knowing which room to put next to another one and which one not. With the importation of the corridor, all relations between the rooms flattened out to a single relationship with the corridor. So all the movements through the building became an issue of canalization. You have to think of the enfilade plan as pieces of a kilt being joined together, and you have to think of the corridor plan as a branch with apples on. And now, knowing so, a fierce contradiction can be detected in the work of William Morris. Morris was somebody who advocated for the revival of the Gothic medieval style in England. And although that has been carried out in the ways of construction and the decorative details, when we look at it from a typological perspective, that is the plan for the house, it is ironically modern. Because the clear application of the corridor with dead-end rooms has nothing to do with the Gothic Middle Ages. This tells something about how obvious and unquestioned the corridor plan had become. William Morris created this fantasy world, consisting of surrounding yourself with nostalgic artifacts and all construction details, but it was all organized in a very modern fashion. But you can also say that surrounding yourself with these embellished things introduced a new form of individualism where, as you can see in the portrait he made for his wife, she's being represented by the things she owns. Later in the 20th century, avoiding each other or optimizing the routes, for worse or better, became almost an obsession for modernist architects. What you see here is a famous drawing by Alexander Klein from his book with the funny title, The Functional House for Frictionless Living. I want to conclude this review of Robin Evans' text by questioning if today, is it a culture of privacy that we pursue, or is it a culture of company? I believe to this end that both these mixed plans from the 17th England, as well as the work of Hermann Herzberger, who, by the way, also founded the Berlage, helps us a great deal in how we could compromise the two desires of company and privacy. That is to say that a world in which rooms becomes corridors and corridors become rooms. Now, this brings me to a series of projects of which I had the pleasure to be part of at the Berlage. And so very briefly about the Berlage, it is a postmaster program for architects at the TU Delft in the Netherlands, wherein you are set with a bunch of amazing people from across the world, delve into what you could call highly collaborative, of experimental way of learning. And for me, it was mostly just a way to start doing research and to create and to learn how to work together without yet knowing in which direction it might go. The first project is about corridors, and it was made way before I knew of the existence of the text I just talked about. Now, what is the project? Well, in between all the super intensive research courses that we had at the Berlage, there was this masterclass planned as a means of taking a pause for a moment. And so it was also led by a Bristol-based artist duo called John Wood and Paul Harrison. And they helped us making films, structures, manifestos, things that deal with ideas of space and also comedy. So I'm going to try to play it, see if it works. I'm just going to talk about it through because it has no sound. And so one of the projects is this film. It's called about corridors, and the idea of this film was to take the corridor and to impose all kinds of activities on it that we associate doing there. So for example, running from one place to another, encountering someone, avoiding someone, knocking on the door. But by doing so, we wanted to express how devoid the corridor is of any kind of program. The corridor in its core has not much other use than just to go from point A to point B. We questioned if the corridor could not become a little bit more room-like. So what we also try to do is we try to strip the corridor from any kind of specificity. So one way to do that is to just clad everything with A4 papers. And the next thing that happens is that you get this grid. And what do you do with that grid? And so we try to emphasize actually the activities we were trying to portray through the grid. At the end, we were doing a bit of random stuff. second project, a very small one, is just an analysis drawing of a project called Misschien Possible. It's a building in Berlin by Bar Architecten in 2010. The whole of the context of this building and the context of the course where it was made is not so important. But what I think is interesting is just the type of drawing. That is to say, a drawing that points out the circulation space, that follows how we travel from door to door, how we go from the street to our apartments, and what spaces and objects we encounter along the way. A third project is a model among others that were made for the exhibition on Paulo Mendes da Rocha in the Casa di Arquitectura in Porto. Paulo Mendes da Rocha was a much recognized Brazilian architect who unfortunately passed away in 2021. For that reason, Casa di Arquitectura in Porto wanted to honor him with an exhibition, and the curation was done by Souto de Mora. The Berlage students were invited to make models of 7 of his important buildings. So to do that, we were taught about the buildings by Vanessa Grossman and Jean-Louis Cohen. And in this way, we took the time to learn about it. And so it happened that Sneha Giresh, a fellow student and friend from India, and I were assigned to build the model of the Butanta house. The house which the architect designed for himself and his family in the 60s in Sao Paulo. And for this lecture, we can just reduce our attention to what's happening with the rooms. The strange thing about this house is that the rooms are divided by thin, non-bearing walls, which you can see here on the image. Those wooden partitions did not touch the ceiling. Maybe you can also see that here in the left picture. And so these rooms allowed smell and sound to travel freely through the house. Mendes da Rocha believed that the house should not be a retreat from the outer world. The absence of modern privacy in the rooms would encourage him and his family to live closer to each other. He had not directly drawn from the Renaissance plans that we just talked about, but rather from Brazilian slums and the traditional houses in Sao Paulo. A good friend of Paulo Mendes da Rocha called it rationalized slums, where every person accepts the presence of the other without solid walls, but rather in a new and desirable condition of the human respect. The main idea was to, in the model, I'm just going to show it here, was to exaggerate the difference between the load-bearing concrete structure and the non-bearing wooden infills, which to us could be represented more as volumes or blocks within the grid. The idea of having a flat model, by the way, also very interesting, which means a bas-relief, came because of the issue of transportation. For this, Jesse Verdoes, an alumnus of the Berlage, guided us through the making process. And so the idea was to make them so flat and have the exact dimensions which would make them fit in a luggage that we could take on the airplane. The fourth project is a film which I took part in together with 2 fellow students. It is a movie about the cleaners in the Faculty of Architecture at the TU Delft. Because after all, interior caretakers have a very strong connection with the spaces they clean. And in this documentary, which we call Catharsis, the first part deals with how we started to fear dirt and how our conception of sin started to collide with what we understand as dirty. This project is included in the presentation because it gave me a better understanding of why we are so inclined to our privacy. A great deal of it can be found in how our Western ideas of dirtiness and cleanliness evolved. So I'm going to show you a little fragment. And also, as a bonus, I just want to mention that for this movie, I composed the music of the introduction. And what I try to do with the music is try to follow the rhythms of the cleaning as to make it feel like a dance.
Deze gebouw, hè? Die gebouw ken ik zo goed. Daarom 22 jaar in deze gebouw gewerkt.
Maar ik kom ook net als van de vloer. Eerst schoongemaakt, dan ben ik een voorvrouw geworden, meewerkend voorvrouw. Zo ben ik gegroeid, nu als objectlijster.
Catharsis describes the process that derives from the verb kathero, that means remove something harmful.
It was in the beginning of the medieval ages, around the 4th century, that Judeo-Christian culture brought forward the idea of sin. Sin was something inherent to our human nature and something that we need to constantly resist. And the focus on sin amplified the connection between morality and cleanliness. To be dirty was to be sinful. We were to feel ashamed about our bodies, skin contact, the sexual and the ugly. It was only in the 19th century that the concept of cleanliness underwent a radical shift. As we got to know more about bacteria, cleanliness became more a topic of hygiene, and we have held on to that idea ever since. What happened was that dirtiness was not only seen as something immoral, it became something dangerous. It became something that makes you sick. Bacteria, viruses and fungi became dreaded villains. They needed to be contested with the mass production of soap, toothpaste, deodorant, shampoo and toilet paper. And so maybe we became deodorized neurotics.
So, 5th and last project. I still have a little bit of time left. It's my contribution to the collective thesis that we did in our last and 3rd semester at the Berlage. I can't go much into detail about the collective project, but I can tell that as a group of 14 international students, we worked on the design of a skyscraper hotel in Manhattan. This skyscraper hotel is subdivided into 14 segments. So 14 students were to design a hotel for 14 different kinds of guests. And so the idea was to accommodate a hyper-diverse audience, as if you were hosting all of the different shades of society. So you would, for example, have a segment for the sailors, a segment for the homeless children, the sex workers, for the single woman, business people, and so on. The segment that I needed to do was that one of the nuclear family. And by that I mean traditional family of married parents and their children. Well, in this lecture we talked about how we increasingly started to value our privacy and how that led to an architecture in which rooms only have one door and are solely connected to a corridor. The nuclear family is actually a 19th century product of that same search for privacy. Before the 19th century, the dominant family form in the West was an extended family, so you would also live together with your grandparents, your uncles, and other family members. But that changed. The nuclear family is a bit more smaller, is a bit more mobile, is a bit more romantic, and that also means a bit more private. With the massive increase of living standards after World War II, the nuclear family became widespread, as well as did more alternative family structures. Today, since World War II, the world is becoming more expensive again, and it is not affordable to have children sometimes, and families often struggle to make ends meet. Where the Western world sought more privacy when it became more rich, it is seeking now refuge again in sharedness as we become more poor again. Sharing things is a solution to tackle the high costs of living. But the only problem is that we don't trust each other that much as we did in the Renaissance period. And so the modern world has learned us not to trust each other. And so in order to make us trust again, we cannot just impose collective living. And I think for a big part, modernist architects failed in addressing that, because what they did was they took this very private idea of having a central corridor and all your little apartment next to each other, we are completely 100% private, and then they would just make a huge collective space, be it a park or interior-wise, and then expect people to behave collectively in that space. And I think if we are to bring people together again and invite them to share things, we should do it more subtly. We should not impose it to say this is private and this is collective. You can invite that in the in-between, between the public and the private sphere. And so I think I learned a great deal from Herman Herzberger's little architectural interventions, which could just be an encouragement to have a conversation with someone. And then if you start to get to know each other in that in-between space, maybe one day you might just invite them over to come into your own private space. And so this is something that I try to integrate into the design that I did for this nuclear family hotel. Try to bring these in-between spaces by, well, importing the porch. The porch is actually an external architectural feature, but I thought I bring it inside in a skyscraper so that where people actually talk to each other that they don't know so well, you would actually also start to do that in the interior. And so I think, just as an end, we need to create these in-between moments again between the private and the public, so that we invite people to be more collective again instead of imposing it on the people. I think that's where I'm gonna stop the lecture now. Thank you so much for listening.